Welcome to another episode of Do Hard Things. Joining us today is Robin Nusslock, a PhD of clinical psychology and associate professor at Northwestern University. Dr. Nusslock's research uses neuroscientific methods to investigate brain systems underlying human thought and emotion, and the involvement of these systems in mental and physical health. Also, Robin is interested in the neuroscience of emotion and decision making. Dr. Nusslock uses behavioral techniques, neurophysiology, and both structural and functional brain imaging to investigate how the brain generates approach, such as reward, and avoidance, such as threat or fear emotional states. He's particularly interested in how emotional brain systems modulate our everyday decisions. Now, I'm intrigued with the underlying mechanics of decision making and how our brains help or hinder our ability to do hard things, and how Robin is taking his studies to go deeper into our cortex to understand how we can unlock the power of our minds. So I'm really quite excited to have this conversation today to see where our minds will take us. And Robin, we've got so much to talk about today, but I'm so excited for you to join us. Welcome to Do Hard Things.
It's a pleasure to be here, Mike, and I'm really excited for this conversation.
Same here. You know, the reality is often when we are working and doing the same thing day in and day out, we tend to go on autopilot and we forget that there's this organ that is just driving everything that we do and we don't even think about it. And that's what blows my mind. And before we really get into some of this stuff, I just like to know from you how you got interested in this area of study.
Yeah, I during my teenage years had a strong interest in mind. I don't know where that emerged from. I found myself reading weird books like, Joseph Campbell's, Power of Myth and Carl Jung, and I was kind of drawn to these investigations, and also was very drawn to Eastern contemplative traditions of meditation and mindfulness, of bringing the unconscious into the conscious and becoming more familiar with the mind. And so as a 19-year-old college student, I was a combination of philosophy and Buddhist studies at the time, really loving what I was studying, but not sure where that was going to take me. I needed some money to earn some fun during the summer. So I saw an advertisement for scrubbing electrodes in a neuroscience lab. And this just happened to be the laboratory of Richie Davidson at the University of Wisconsin, who, I had no idea I was walking into the center of the universe of the neuroscience of emotion. And I'm scrubbing electrodes, and on my third day there, I hear this rustling in the hallway, and I look out, and it's a film crew with the Dalai Lama walking down the hallway for what was to become the cover episode of National Geographic on the science of mind. And so I put down the toothbrush to scrub electrodes and snuck into the meetings and spent 3 days in this exquisite meeting on a conversation between leading thinkers in neuroscience and leading thinkers in Buddhist cosmology. Walked out of that meeting, switched my major to psychology and neuroscience, did my undergrad and my grad work at the University of Wisconsin, and have never looked back.
Holy smokes. I mean, first of all, what would ever imagine, how could you ever imagine putting yourself in a position to even meet the Dalai Lama, much less have the opportunity to just sit there and listen to what they were discussing and preparing for with this National Geographic episode on, literally the leader of Buddhism, and what possessed you to actually take that opportunity to go and do that?
Well, I saw in that moment that the confluence of my interests were colliding, which is I wanted to study the mind, but I wanted something that was a bit more tractable. And, I saw neuroscience and psychology as a way of really doing that. And so I really, dove full in. And I've had an extraordinary opportunity in the last 3 or 4 years to kind of come back full circle, where I've been now spending a fair amount of time in India at the Dalai Lama's monastery, creating a neuroscience laboratory under his guidance to train his monastics in neuroscience to increase the conversation between, people who are really investigating their minds through personal experience versus the neuroscientific community, which is using the tools of physics and computer science and neuroscience to study the mind. And so, it's been a real kind of ongoing conversation for me between tools that are designed to investigate your mind through personal experience versus the tools of science and neuroscience. And it's a love affair. I mean, where that interest, where that moment emerges from is unknown to me, but I know it's what I'm on the planet to do.
Well, that's a lot of what we experience in our lives. A lot of people think is happenstance or serendipity, but I feel like we project something in our behavior, in our actions that draws like things to us. And I don't know if it's kismet, I don't know if it's fate, but there's something that we're I don't know, we're feeling some sort of an energy. We're keyed into the right megahertz or something on the radio dial where that's just something that allows us to follow maybe a path, and you put yourself into a position to take advantage of it, but you still have to make the decisions what to do once you're at a crossroads or once you come to a door. Do you knock on that door? Do you open it up? And I'm really interested in how the mind is one thing, the brain itself is the physical thing, and how it dictates some of the decisions that we make. Because I think at the highest levels, we perceive things differently, right? Some people perceive things as too hard, and some people perceive things as too scary, and they don't go through those doors. And how much of it is a function of the brain, and how much of it is a function of simply our environment dictating what the answer in our own mind should be?
Yeah, great questions. I mean, the brain is an organ, and like all organs in the body, it wants to expend the least amount of energy possible, right? The brain uses about a third of our metabolic energy. So it's a hugely demanding organ. And the brain wants to make reality as simple as possible. It's motivated to basically find the path of least resistance and make the decision in as pre-conscious and unconscious of a way as possible. And I think a lot of the path of success, excellence, awakening, whatever you want to call it, is making those unconscious processes conscious and bringing them up into awareness so that we have more opportunities and deliberations and various things like that that we can actually make decisions on. Because most of the neuroscience field would suggest that what we experience as consciousness is the byproduct of pre-conscious brain processes that just kind of hiccup into consciousness. But we also have this extraordinary organ that for some reason in our kind of history has developed the capacity to reflect on itself and not be purely driven by pre-conscious and or unconscious processes, and actually become aware of ourselves in ways that are quite unique. And so, I think that there is an invitation to the human brain to actually make that which is unconscious conscious, realize that most of what we're doing is habit-based. The brain is looking for habits to make sense of the world in an easy way. And, habits become your character over time, but you have the ability to make small changes in habits that result in big changes in character. And I think that for me is the journey of awakening.
Yeah. So, I've had some conversations with folks on my team about learning how to think big, and that feeling of trepidation when you try to think big, but your brain is holding you back. And I've read in a number of different books and articles about this amygdala, which is like your lizard brain, where it is like byproduct or a leftover remnant of our ancient selves that prevented us from being on the menu, all those eons ago. And yet now we're, you know, unless we're out in the middle of the Sahara or if we're in the middle of the jungle and something is literally hunting us, there aren't any of these monsters that this brain remnant is supposed to solve for us. So it creates monsters for ourselves. How do you work at overcoming that fear that it creates in you so that you can actually do more than you think you're capable of doing?
Yeah, it's a great point. You know, the brain evolved to solve challenges that are very different than what we face today. When we in our evolutionary history saw a threat, we had this explosion of stress biology in us that helped us navigate away from that threat, whether it be a predator or a particular, other type of thing that we needed to avoid for survival. And we have those systems in us today. Unfortunately, we wouldn't have survived if we didn't have them. But what's amazing is that we can activate the same stress biology as we would running away from a lion, as we do thinking about our 401k or thinking about getting a job or thinking about putting food on the table for our families. And then the brain developed this prefrontal cortex, which is this piece of tissue right behind our forehead, which allows us to prospect into the future and retrospect in the past. The prefrontal cortex can activate those stress biology systems just as if we were seeing a lion, a tiger, or a bear. And so a lot of the challenges that we face as human beings is that we can activate these stress systems in ourselves that are highly adaptive in short terms, but under chronic situations, we can activate them in ways that they become chronic because we can always be thinking about that which is scaring for us. And so the question becomes is how do we relinquish ourselves from that amygdala hijack, that amygdala grip, or various things like that? First of all, I would say is that the amygdala gets a bad rap. I mean, a lot of people think that there's a core distinction between cognition and emotion, but there's no region in our brain that's not affected by emotion. There's no region in our brain that doesn't also, isn't affected by cognition. They're in this dynamic dance with each other. And so I think the goal is to find an optimal synergy between the emotional brain and the putative thinking brain. Many of the major decisions we make in our lives are actually embedded deep in our subcortex, right? You don't go around thinking about a cost benefit analysis of who you're going to marry. It's a feeling. So a lot of the passion, a lot of the purpose that we get are actually from these kind of reptilian parts of our brain. But the idea is, how do we use them as our masters rather than as our servants? And the one kind of way that I would suggest you do that is by doing that which you're afraid of. The mere act of leaning in and doing the act that you're afraid of actually reorganizes the learning patterns in those parts of the brain in a way that can facilitate the momentum that you are actually pursuing. So do that which is difficult, hence the name of your podcast, do the hard things. That will reorganize the brain's learning system to say, hey, I can actually do that.
So, but is it really hard, or is it perceived as hard? Because the brain doesn't look at physical hardship the same way it looks at this fear of doing something hard or this fear of failure. I think it's two different things. And the question that I've got is the brain hardwired to let us not rise above? Does it want us to be below the plane? And if so, how do we fix that? Because it takes effort.
Mm-hmm. It takes effort. I think you can approach this question from different levels of analysis. So there's a lot of existential psychologists would say that we're really motivated by meaning. And what really, drives us for a sense of purpose is, or what drives our kind of lives, or a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, a sense of what is the goal of self-actualization, which many psychologists talk, which is the sense of kind of, having a purpose that we're really connected to, our psychological North Star, that gets us up out of bed to pursue the goals that we want to pursue in our life. And I think that's a very real process. I think a lot of what happens is that we have these broad existential values that we want to pursue and go for in the sense of accomplishment. That existential system is balanced again by brain systems that are a bit more lazy or a bit lazier. And this introduces a second part of the brain that I think is really interesting to talk about, which is the midbrain dopamine system. So you have this part of your brain, which is basically a threat system, which you could think of as the brain's brake pad, right? This is the part of the brain that's basically, I want to fight, I want to freeze, I want to, stay in place. It's a very threat-based system. But an alternative system, yeah.
Does that part of the brain, is that what creates the drive to have your adrenal glands create adrenaline, or is that a natural? Is that what happens after you've already decided you got to run?
Well, that's a fascinating question. And that's an age-old debate in the field of psychology. Does the body precede the brain, or does the brain precede the body? And I'd say it's bidirectional, it's circular. So that amygdala region that you referred to has the amygdala has these direct pathways to stress biology systems in the periphery. And there's two primary stress biologies that we have in the periphery. One is called the sympathetic nervous system, which is basically an immediate stress response, which creates increased heart rate. It creates a sense of, increased respiration. It prepares you for defense. And the second is a slower system that you referenced, which is related to the adrenal glands that release a hormone called cortisol, which really prepare the body for a state of defense and and the primary thing that system does, if I was to put an electrode in your brain right now and activate the amygdala, the primary thing that would happen is you would freeze. The freezing response is the ancient kind of primordial response of our threat systems. It basically creates a state of kind of, freezing. And I don't mean being cold freezing. I'm talking about freezing your behavior. It's like you're kind of scanning the environment. The alternative
deer in the headlights
is this dopamine system. So if you think of the amygdala as the brain's brake pedal, the midbrain dopamine system is the brain's gas pedal. This is the part of your brain that's designed to get you up off the couch to go pursue rewards in your environment. This could be food. This could be a person that you want to meet. This could be wanting to do your 12th Ironman, as you alluded to, as being a personal goal. This is a motivational system. This is the brain's accelerator. Now, what's interesting is that the brain does a pretty complex cost-benefit analysis to say, is the goal worth it, or is the goal not worth it? If a goal is impossible, your midbrain dopamine system is not going to become activated because there's no reason to go pursue the goals. If the goal is incredibly easy, your midbrain dopamine system is not going to be activated because the reward's coming. So they've done research in rodents and primates and humans to suggest that at about a 50% success rate, that's where you get the highest level of activation of these midbrain dopamine system, because then the cost benefit analysis is such that you want to get up off the couch to go get it because there's a chance you're going to do it. The final component of this is that what do you actually assign meaning to go pursue? And for you, for example, with Ironmans, you've placed a lot of psychological value and meaning on that. It's obviously attainable because you've done 5 of them. So you have this kind of history of behavior that gets you up off the couch and to go pursue that. And it's the tension between the brain's brake pad, which is the amygdala, and the brain's gas pedal, which is this midbrain dopamine system, that defines a lot of our life decisions. Do we go or do we stay?
So it sounds to me like the reward is what is driving our brain. And the question I've got is, what is the reward?
Well, the reward, it's a great question. The reward is whatever the brain finds rewarding. And it's not an avoidance of the question. So let me unpack it. The midbrain dopamine system is activated by food. It's activated by primary stimuli. All of those things are incredibly rewarding to the brain. It's activated by drugs. If somebody's addicted to drugs, you show them a picture of their primary drug stimulus, their midbrain dopamine system explodes. But humans have this kind of, additional layer of neuronal complexity where we also find value in rewards out of things like getting into the job that we want, doing an Ironman, having a meaningful life, succeeding at work, getting into heaven if you're religious. I mean, that's talking about a delayed gratification. You're going to make decisions now so that you get into the nursing home of your choice, or you get into, some place in the sky. I mean, the brain has an incredible capacity to establish goals and then navigate current behavior around those goals. And those are the fascinating point is that whether you want to get into the nursing home of your choice or get a piece of pizza, it's all mediated by the same brain system. There's all kind of the same biology. Your brain has ascribed different values to different rewards in the environment. And then you kind of, organize your behavior accordingly.
So when you're looking at that reward system and this dopamine, you said that, for example, if you're a drug user, the drug explodes the dopamine in your body. But it sounds to me like dopamine is the drug. It's like that's what our body is releasing when we get that drug or that thing that generates that dopamine rush. Is it a drug to us?
Well, it's a drug to us in the sense that it activates these psychological states that drugs often mimic, right? So we don't go around taking stress biology drugs because, they wouldn't make us feel very good. We go around taking drugs that are designed to activate these internal biological systems that we already have. But I want to break it down in one additional level of the reward system, because I think you might find this interesting. It turns out if you look at kind of positive rewarding emotions in the brain, there's two neurochemicals that are really important. One is a dopamine system, and the other are what are called the opioid systems in your brain, the endogenous opioids. It turns out that these brain systems are associated with different psychological states of reward. This is based on the work of Kent Berridge at the University of Michigan. The dopamine system is the wanting system. The dopamine system is the part of you that is looking at something and you want it. It's a goal that you're pursuing. It's a stimulus that you're pursuing. It's not a very relaxed state when you are in a high dopamine state, because it's an engine that's moving you towards the rewards that you want to pursue. Once you actually attain that reward, a different set of neurochemistry comes online that's primarily driven by the opioids. So when you bury your face in the cake, or you cross the finish line of an Ironman, or you have a moment at work that's very meaningful to you and you've succeeded, that's a very different psychological state. That's a state of contentment, kind of satisfaction, and kind of more well-being. And what's interesting about pursuing hard things, I mean, the title of your podcast is about doing hard things. It's finding meaning and joy and pleasure in the pursuit as much as it is the attainment, that I think is a really interesting tension in the psychology of motivation. That the act of actually getting up off the couch and pursuing something becomes the reward, because you're bettering yourself, you're extending yourself, you're finding value in this pure sense of becoming more than who you are, as opposed to just deliciating in the kind of, opioids of, oh, I've arrived, now I can sit on the couch and relax. And I think those are interesting tensions in the brain between those different pursuits. So if I think about,
I am incredibly interested in this because, the reality is we spend so much of our time working.
yeah,
And for the most part, we look at work as a four-letter word. And that's not in a good way. The reality is, we don't derive a lot of pleasure out of it. And if I think of doing something hard, doing what you don't like to do every single day and not getting any feeling or good feeling out of it, I can't imagine a more difficult thing to do. So, what's happening there? What is not allowing somebody to reposition the way that they're approaching their job and extracting some pleasure out of it?
I think they're internal and they're external factors. So the internal factor is, well, let's actually start with the external factor. The external factor would be you have an environment that's not supportive of that kind of personal creative pursuits, right? I mean, you can imagine a work environment where you're bringing really highly motivated people into your environment. And I'm talking about myself too, all of us. And you bring people in, and then you create an environment that doesn't allow that person to tap into that intrinsic internal motivational drive, whether it's through a high fear-based managerial model, whether it's through a system that doesn't allow for any kind of advancement or reinforcement. A person's in some mid-management job where there's no motivation, there's no extrinsic motivation to do anything because they're always going to be in the same job regardless. You can imagine a situation in which it's highly competitive and antagonistic, or people's creative insights aren't valued. I mean, if we go back to that 50% dopamine probability curve, what's the point of getting up off the couch and having an insight if it's not going to be reinforced in the environment? The internal component of it is that, I think this goes back to this idea that the brain is fundamentally a lazy organ. And I think a part of the journey of awakening, or whatever you want to call it, self-actualization, is, actually starting to enjoy the journey more than the end game. And, there's wonderful work by a woman named Carol Dweck, who's a psychologist at Stanford, who has a book called Mindset. And she talks about mindset as a great way of navigating yourself, but also managing employees. And the idea in mindset is that failure is to be celebrated. That she uses the quote, fail better, fail forward. Actually, instead of seeing failure as something that is a negative, reprogramming and tricking the mind to see it as actually an opportunity to become more than who you are in the moment. And this is drawn on a lot of cognitive science research to suggest that the mind is kind of an idiot. You can trick the thing pretty easily. And, I think of this quote by Mike Tyson, not a great guy, but a great quote maker. He said, discipline is doing that which you hate and learning to love it. And I think, there are people that have that capacity to actually trick itself into saying, I'm getting so much out of waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning and getting out on my bike and riding, because I know I'm becoming more than who I am. And so your brain has ascribed a meaning, a value, a reward, a currency to that. And that allows for those kind of paradigm shifts in behavior, and whether it's personal or whether it's professional.
Thank God the brain is or the mind is an idiot. It would make things even more difficult to do if you were so rigid that you were thinking. But I love this idea of hacking your brain and learning to love the process and the mindset, the growth mindset. I think people look at it. I don't know that they look at it the way that maybe this author Carol, is it Dweck?
Yeah, it's a DWECK.
I'm actually going to pick this up because I love the idea of having a growth mindset.
That's actually the phrase she uses, growth mindset. She might even coin that term. So you're actually already, in line with her spirit and logic.
Well, the reality is, I prescribe to the notion that you cannot get any gain without resistance. And resistance is usually associated with pain or fear. And, you should run towards fear, not away from it if you want to escape it. It's just, you go to the thing that hurts you because it's never as bad as you think it is. And it is because there's some perceived reward at the end of it. Nothing good or nothing worth doing should be easy, right? And so you're going to feel some pain, but it's worth it at the end. That's the reward. The growth mindset, it to me seems like the way you can create in your own mind a set of things that you're willing to do in order to achieve something in the future, but there has to be a plan. How can we build processes that allow us to do that without taking on too much?
Mm.
Because if it's too hard to do at the overall, you're just never going to go do it. The reward is not worth it. You've got this, you need a 50-50. How do you set your mind to allow yourself to actually accomplish this big thing that you're trying to do?
Yeah, I think you raised two great points, which is one, how do you um, facilitate this kind of passionate drive? But the second is how do you become wise about what you're driving towards? Because both of those are required for success, right? I mean, if you're driving towards, unattainable or suboptimal goals, what's the point of having a great mindset? So let's unpack the first. I think I like your phrase, hacking the brain or hacking the mind. And I think Carol's work really taps into the psychology of this, which is to take that which you're afraid of and lean into it and do that which you're afraid of, which is only part of the equation. The second part of the equation is, instead of recoiling at failure or loss, actually see that as an opportunity to become more than who you are. I mean, that's a real brain hack. I mean, that is going against all of our evolutionary drive to kind of recoil back into that amygdala hijack state, freeze ourselves in place and not get up off the couch. This is saying, no, the very thing that is scary to us becomes an opportunity to become more than who we are. And, we may have evolved brain systems that cause us to freeze, but that doesn't in any way suggest that we need to actually live by that ancient logic. I mean, if we lived by the logic of evolutionary drive, we wouldn't be very, successful, optimal people. It'd be a lot of kind of, ancient behavior that we wouldn't want to be doing or repeating. So I think we have not only the permission, but in some respects, the obligation to transcend the ancient reptilian mindset and actually lean into that which we're afraid of. And I think, a lot of it is just that prefrontal lobe saying, oh, wow, this is terrible. I failed phenomenally here. What is the opportunity to learn? And I think that is, for me, the biggest brain hijack, which is to actually, or brain, I should say brain hack, which is to really reorganize my outcomes so that the thing that I'm afraid of becomes the reward. And then the second component is, how do you actually become wise about what the goals are to pursue? And I think that's a whole separate conversation that we can dive into, but that's a very important goal.
If I go back to the point that you were making about learning from your failure, first off, the failure, I think, is what the fear is, because the pain that's associated with the idea that you failed in front of all these people, and it's this perception that they think of you a certain way that is really preventing you from taking action and doing that thing that's hard. But I also always hear of, as long as you're learning a lesson, it's not really failure. The problem is, I don't know that you are aware of the learning in the moment because you're so focused on the failing.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you learn from the lessons or learn from the failure that you're experiencing when you're in the moment dealing with the pain? That's one thing I've always questioned for people that have talked about things that they've overcome and how they learned from it. At what point did they learn it? Did they learn it while it's happening, or was it after many, many months of reflection and realizing that they're not dead? They've grown in some way. How can we help other people who are going through it in the moment?
I think there's two components to that. So the first is that people way overvalue the impact that success and failure will have on their psychological well-being. So just to kind of provide another book, this is the work of Dan Gilbert, who wrote a book called Stumbling on Happiness. He shows that people who, say, for example, become paraplegics or quadriplegics are actually about as happy 4 or 5 years after the accident as they were before the accident. Or he did research in my field in the academy where people, didn't get tenure, which is kind of, a tragic outcome in academia, and found that people who went through that tragic outcome, quote unquote, were as happy as they were, as if they had gotten tenure. And so the brain really overvalues, the impact that they think life events will have on our well-being. So that's one component of it. Is I think
Why?
I think it probably taps into evolutionary drives where we were wired for reproductive success and threats, and avoiding death. And so the brain, developed these motivational systems that are not necessarily reflective of the true nature of reality, but create strong motivational circuits in us to, survive our evolutionary history, because it was hugely adaptive. And then, through reproduction, those systems become deeply embedded in the brain. But, I think however it evolved, it highlights for us that if we can realize that part of, brain hacking ourselves is understanding that which we're afraid of, if it happens, probably won't have the effect that we actually think it will happen, and thus we act accordingly. And the second part of this relearning process, I would say, is that it doesn't have to be super cognitive. It's just literally getting up and doing it. So, we can sit and psychoanalyze the heck out of something, which is, has value to it. But ultimately, it's like, do you just get up and do it again? Do you just show up? I think that's 80% of it. So, for example, in my field of academia, the failure rate is 90%. I think about the funding rates at the National Institute of Health. Only about 10% of the grants get funded at any particular cycle. And I honestly think the majority of what predicts success is, are you stubborn enough to just simply show up at the next submission? And whether you've learned some deep lesson, maybe or maybe not, but it's just that willingness to just kind of keep coming back and showing up. And I think that's a lot of what the success quotient is just kind of a certain degree of commitment to just saying, I'm just going to show up again. I'm just going to get up again. I'm just going to kind of run again or do whatever it is again, because that's what allows me to learn, is just by doing.
First off, just show up. Holy smokes, so much can be accomplished if you just show up. And now it makes so much more sense just talking to you about this, because I think in the back of your mind, that you just can't quit. And the only thing that I can attest to that is that the only thing that every winner has in common with all the other winners out there is that they did not quit. And the reality is, it doesn't matter what you're doing, but as long as you're showing up and you're doing it, you are making yourself much more capable of achieving the success that you're looking for. Doesn't matter if it's scary or not. That's incredible. I love that. I love that
so
thinking.
much of learning in the brain happens pre-consciously. So I guess the point I'm saying is that having mindfulness of all of these processes is really important, and I think that's an important ingredient. But to be honest, most of the kind of neuronal circuitry of learning is entirely outside of conscious awareness. And so you may not think you're learning something grand or profound by just showing up again and doing that which you're afraid of, but your brain is learning something. And over time, when you look back and realize that you've done 10 things that you are afraid of, but you've just gone ahead and done it, you now have a different kind of neural network in your brain that has just said, hey, I did it 10 times before, I can do it now. You may not have had some grand insight when on the third time you were doing it, but eventually you're going to have this history, this database in your brain that says, I've shown up multiple times and just done it in this scary situation, I can do it again. And that is the sheer act of action that can lead to really robust neuroplastic changes in the brain that lead to these positive outcomes.
So it is becoming much, much more clear to me that there are so many factors that influence the decisions that we make, that being aware of them would be exhausting. And now that I know that we've got internal and external forces that are focusing on this, plus we've got ancient hardwiring in our minds, I can't even imagine where to start when I think of the next big project that I want to do. But I also know that I have to create at least a habit that I can adhere to that makes a little bit of sense. And part of that is rewarding maybe the process that you're following and breaking down your goals into chunklets, which is, when I train for doing an Ironman, I've got to do it in chunks that I can actually physically do and get through my day without killing myself, and get some enjoyment out of it. Do you have any tricks that we can use that when we get together as a team and maybe want to do some project, how we can convince ourselves to do it on the days where we feel great with the same level of intensity as the days that it's cold and rainy and we just don't want to do it? How do you hack your brain into thinking that at least get through this little effort?
Yeah, I think part of it is realizing that maybe it doesn't have to be the same intensity. I think that part is that can be part of the pressure quotient, which we put on ourselves, that we feel like we need to be in a psychological state to show up. And I struggle with this, where I feel, much of my career is writing, right? Because I'm an academic. And so, one of the challenges I have as an academic is I feel like I need to be in a certain psychological space in order to write. And one of the best pieces of advice I ever heard was, don't wait to feel good to sit down at your computer to write. Just sit down at your computer and start writing. And eventually your brain will catch up with the action that you're doing. So I think part of, kind of being in a team where you're trying to kind of pursue these big goals is I think the Ironman actually is a great example. I mean, you need to break this into a 2-year training plan with small rewards and small goals, and celebrate those rewards, and find enjoyment in the actual act of that small micro goal, and that becomes additive and accumulates over time, and that is the awakening journey. But the second thing I would say is, part of anxiety is thinking that you need to be perfect, thinking that it needs to be a high intensity workout every time, or that you need to be in some psychological space to get on the bike or sit down at the computer. And if you're waiting for that space to act, you're just going to be waiting for a long time. And I think this goes back to the idea that the sheer act of showing up, particularly when you don't want to show up. I mean, this is kind of the brain hack moment. Showing up when you don't want to show up creates a database in your brain of moments that you now have shown up when you don't want to show up. So the next time when you don't want to show up, you can say, I did it last time, let's do it now. That is really the kind of transformative, nature of the brain, where it just creates a learning record, a learning history, which it then can rely on at the next time where it doesn't want to show up.
How do you guard against? I love the idea that every effort doesn't have to be 100% effort. In fact, you can only have 100% effort that you're training for, and external forces will even prevent that from happening very often. But the consistency of coming and showing up every day, maybe not 100% each time, um, is, I think, more important.
Yeah.
And what is it that we can do to tell ourselves that we're capable of doing that? And what does it do for other people when they see that we're showing up, and maybe not every day is a home run, but the consistency? Is it the consistency that matters most?
Yeah, I mean, it really is getting into how do you create a psychology of habit. I mean, really what we're talking about is creating small habits that sum to big outcomes over time, right? Um, and I think the psychology of habit is an interesting field. And in my reading of that field, a lot of what they say is make it as easy as possible for yourself. So, if you're looking to lose weight, don't have high fat food in the fridge. If you're looking to work out, have your all of your gear ready to go up, ready to get on in the morning. Don't have to get up and search for it and look through everything. It's kind of creating these small micro pathways to success. I think one of the challenges of transformative behavior is people think that it needs to be big movements and big outcomes right away. But the brain is just, it will have those big outcomes, it will have those big moments, and then it will say, well, it needs to be that way every time. And I think starting from small steps and really kind of small micro reorganizations that creates a bottom-up approach of small accumulations of success, really allows for the establishment of a habit that then becomes kind of a bigger character.
And at some point, then, just showing up and doing the same effort may not satisfy you enough. You're going to force yourself to do a little bit more to get maybe a dopamine rush that you're looking for. Maybe that is the reward. Is that how this is hacking it?
That's the second ingredient of brain hack, right? So you could say that just showing up is part of it, but just showing up only matters if you're showing up for some goal structure that actually means something to you, right? Because otherwise you're just showing up and you're just creating a new kind of mediocre pattern. So I think the second component of it is to find that which you're passionate about and reorganize your life around that particular thing. I mean, I was fortunate when I was 19 to have that meeting with the Dalai Lama and a bunch of neuroscientists that cracked my brain with such an explosion of purpose and passion that I just walked out of that meeting and reorganized my entire life around it. Now, that doesn't mean that we all need to have kind of, these transformative moments, but I think it really calls on us with a sense of responsibility to say, what are we passionate about? And then have the courage to actually reorganize our lives. Now, maybe that's on a micro level because if you can't drop everything but reorganize moments in our lives to actually pursue those rewards. So I think this is this kind of multi-prong approach. One is take the time to find what you're passionate about and have the courage, the audacity, the kind of rebelliousness to say, I want it. And then once you find that, then say, all right, how do I create habit behaviors of small successes that actually pursue that? And I don't think the kind of, finding your passion has to be destructive and I'm going to, leave all of my life in order to go climb Mount Everest. I mean, it could be, I think I love your example of in the context of your life, you're getting up, you're going to the pool, you're getting on the bike, you're running, you're doing these small micro moments over the course of the day to pursue these big rewards. And, in a sense, you've already hacked your brain to do these impossible things. And I think you found a passion and then you created habits to pursue it.
Yeah. And now the question is, how do you apply it to your work life? And it could be literally that simple, where the process of doing the stuff every day that you need to do becomes your reward, doing it well and doing it better one day over the next day, knowing that you can't give 100% every single day, but the culmination of everything is going to get you to do a big thing that scared the hell out of you at the beginning of the year, and that you've achieved this objective and you did it quicker than you ever imagined you could. That's ultimately the best hack.
The challenge is, let's say you're in a job that you're not happy with, and let's say you have 3 kids that you need to put, food on the table for. And you could listen to this podcast and say, that sounds great for people who have the freedom to create some revolution in their life to go pursue, these big goals. Well, I can't do that. And I guess my challenge to somebody in that position, and, we're all in that position at moments in our lives, is to actually really take value in your self-improvement. And the self-improvement could be just a small walk in the middle of the day. It could be, a smile to a coworker. It could be, I mean, these don't need to be kind of grandiose gestures. These can be small micro moments that are a part of a currency of self-improvement, that no matter what the situation you find yourself in, no matter how desolate or how delightful, there's an opportunity to become more than who you are. Not in some aggressive kind of self-pounding way, but in a real exciting, compassionate extension in the ability to kind of do the hard things, because that is the journey, as opposed to just saying, I can't wait home to get on the couch and sit and relax. I mean, that's the brain hack, is finding the passion in the stretching of the self, whether it's showing up and smiling to a coworker that you're not really getting along with, or whether it's pursuing an Ironman. It's all the same system.
Doc, I got to tell you, what we have here is just scratching the surface of the tangents of questions that I've got coming off of this. And I really appreciate you even just peeling back the onion on this piece, because I think it's because we don't think of it very often, and yet it's really driving everything that we're doing. I think it's something that we really need to start focusing on a little bit more to help us just improve our own lives before we can even just focus on improving the way that we approach our personal growth, our professional growth, and bettering ourselves. And I would love the opportunity to kind of go into other areas of this, because the work that you're doing is also aimed at helping people recover from drug addiction and how it impacts their ability to engage in society as a rule. So I would love to explore a little bit more about this,
Happy to.
maybe on another episode, because just way too much to talk about in the 45 minutes that we've been chatting.
Yeah, I love it.
I do have a question though, and I like to ask this of the people that come on this show, because we are doing a lot of hard things, and I think people would love to hear maybe something that you are planning to do that you've had in the back of your mind, either professionally or personally, that you consider to be hard,
Mm.
but you just haven't done it yet.
Yeah, no,
Can
there's a
you
real
hear
prime
us hear a
example.
little bit about what you're doing?
Yeah, no, so you know, I'm an academic, and so writing papers and writing grants is always the most exciting and most difficult thing that I do in my life. And there is a paper that I have been, I have many papers going on at any given point in time. But there's a paper that's kind of my North Star that I've been wanting to write for a long time. And I got an invitation to write it, and I got too busy. And so I couldn't find the time to work on it. And it just has been nagging at me. And then I got to the point where I was scared to even search my email for the invitation, because I was like, is there a deadline on the paper? Did I miss it? Did I blow this chance? A colleague of mine is expecting me to write it. I'm getting cues that he's wondering when it's happening. So I think it was on Sunday, I was like, all right, I'm going to calm my stress biology down, and I'm going to just start by searching the email. And I searched the email, and I saw it, and I saw there was no deadline. I was like, oh. And then all of a sudden I walked away from my desk, and I walked around my home for about 10 minutes and thought of, well, what do I want to write? And I had just like this flood of feeling of excitement around it, this feeling of clarity, and this commitment to reorganize my schedule to make time for this paper. But it was months before I actually got the courage up to just check the damn email. And so I guess the summary point I would have is just check the damn email. It's not as bad as you think. It's probably going to open up a lot of doors.
I
And just,
love that. I mean, honestly, I know the feeling that you've got. This is incredible to hear. It's just like you echoing things in my own mind.
yeah.
So, have you put a deadline on the paper for yourself now that you've gotten this emotion to go and do it?
So I think what I'm doing right now is taking some time to really figure out my path forward. And my goal is to within the next week or so email the editor and give myself a hard deadline, because then I will know that I will reorganize my schedule to meet it. So I haven't done that yet, because I think this is kind of determining what the wise goals are. I think out of my enthusiasm, I could email him and say, John, I'll have the paper to you in 2 weeks. That wouldn't be realistic. So I kind of have to pause, get a sense of the landscape, create a clear path forward, and then might hold myself accountable and say, in a week or so, I'm going to send that email and give myself a hard deadline and meet it no matter what. So I'm trying to kind of balance the wise mind with the passionate mind.
Great lesson for all of us to learn. Just read the damn email. It's not as bad as you think it is. Doc, I really do appreciate you joining us today. Chip, I think we're pretty much good to go. Thank you very much for sharing a lot of this. I'm going to make certain that I actually write down some of the key things here and get some of the books that you've identified in here. And is there a link or two that you want us to provide to people? Maybe some of the work that you've already done that you'd like me to share?
Well, I think if people just Google my name, it's Robin Nusslock, Robin. Nusslock's the last name, Nusslock. I have a website for my department, and I have a personal website that's my laboratory. Again, I use brain imaging technology to study how the brain creates emotion. And if people are interested in the work we're doing, we have all of our publications posted on the website. We have talks that we've given on YouTube that are there, and you can just learn more about it. And please email me at nusslock@northwestern.edu if you have any questions.
I really appreciate that, and I'll make sure that we all get that access. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure's mine.
All righty. Chip?